My work moved more towards narrative under the influence of Max Jacob. My most recent collection was absolutely soaked in Max Jacob's book. I mean, too much so, because I was translating his work during the period of COVID, and I was a bit weird anyway because of COVID, and I was writing this book, and his spirit was absolutely everywhere. Incredible. But hopefully, I do distinguish myself enough from Max Jacob in the book.
Hello, and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm here today with Ian Seed, who has come all the way from Lancaster.
That's right.
Good journey?
Great journey. Lovely, quiet train.
Now, you've got a lot of roles across the board, haven't you? You're an award-winning poet, you're a translator, you're a short story writer, and an essayist and an editor.
That's right. And I think the roles do actually all feed into each other.
What's your favourite one out of those?
I'm not sure I have a favourite one. Probably I write more poetry of a kind than anything else, and probably more prose poems than poetry as well, whatever a prose poem is.
Well, whatever a prose poem is, that I'm really looking forward to this discussion, because all I need to say at this point is I don't know what a prose poem is, and I hope to be able to understand as we talk.
You probably won't, but then neither will I either, so...
All will be revealed from
all
here
be
on.
revealed, yes.
So, Ian, this podcast will be going out in just about the time that the universities go back in September, or Michaelmas, I believe, as it was once known. And you've just finished a fellowship at Liverpool University. Do you enjoy the role?
I do enjoy the role very much. I enjoy working with young people, as I have done for a number of years. I enjoy helping students shape their essays, draft their essays. I love it when students go away and they feel much more confident. I think above all that instilling in students a sense of confidence in their writing and in the writing processes of writing an essay, which is not dissimilar to the act of creative writing. In fact, I always say to the students that writing an essay is just as creative as writing a story or a poem.
Yes. So you instill the confidence. How confident did you feel when you began as a fellow?
Not very confident, and even now, even though I'd been a university lecturer before that, but it is very different, because you never quite know what the student is going to come in with. You don't know you have a name and maybe the outline of an issue they want to talk about, but quite often they don't send the essay beforehand, they bring it in with them, and I usually print out 2 copies, one for the student, one for me. But I have no idea what I'm going to look at or what real problems the student has. And I guess it's a bit like being a GP, actually. You don't quite know what the patient is going to bring with, and often the problem they think they have is not actually the real problem, it's something else which you have to diagnose.
And what did you find that the main problem was for students?
I'm sure our other RLF fellows will say something similar, but I think the biggest problem is they don't draft and redraft their essays. A lot of it is just a question of process. Sheena Wilkerson actually has written a very good article about this for the RLF. But it's a question of writing, of planning, writing a first draft, printing out the first draft, reading it out loud, annotating a physical copy, then making a second draft and going through that, knowing what to look for in your first draft. Is this what the tutor wants? Is there a story in the essay, or is it just a bit of sort of random points strung together, which can happen? Is there a proper introduction, conclusion? Do the paragraphs link up? And often, actually, what I've found with essays is that the story actually is there, hidden in the essay. The story that every essay has a story, and the story is usually in the essay, but it's hidden because they haven't maybe linked up the paragraphs enough, or they haven't made their points clearly enough. And then maybe they're not quite aware themselves of what the story of the essay is. But then just talking about it with the RLF fellow can really, really help. I think some of us are more planners and some of us are more discoverers. So some of the students may be discoverers rather than planners. So they discover what it is they want to say when they're writing. But I think that is okay. But you must be prepared to draft and to redraft. I think that's the biggest thing I think students can take away from.
So if you're the doctor, and I love that way of looking at it, how successful were you at healing the students?
It's difficult to do that a quantitative result on that, but so many students have told me that they've felt inspired, that they have renewed confidence, and also tutors have also told me as well that the students have improved as a result of seeing me and are more confident as well.
You said you worked at a university?
I did, yes. I was senior lecturer in creative writing at the University of Chester, and then I'm still a visiting lecturer there as well. I still do the odd lecture for them now too.
And how does that contrast with your role with the RLF? Because it's quite different being embedded there, almost like a spy.
It is. It definitely is. And I definitely get things a little bit from the other side as well. It's probably maybe more sympathetic towards the students actually as well.
Yeah.
I can see now how, perhaps a bit more now as RLF fellow, how students can struggle with self-confidence and can be a bit shy. So, they can come and talk to me and they know it's not going to affect their mark or anything.
Ian, I'd like us to listen to something from the Deep RLF archive now. It's a recording by Ros Schwartz on the changing attitudes to translation.
Once upon a time, translators were humble creatures waiting timidly in the background for crumbs from the publisher's table, grateful for any scraps thrown their way, and certainly not being vociferous. When I began my career in the early 1980s, I used to champion French books I wanted to translate, only to be told by publishers, "We don't do translations," as if translations were a genre. A small number of avant-garde houses built their reputations publishing international writing, Peter Owen, Marion Boyers, Harville, among others. But translated fiction was considered elitist, and there were numerous myths about foreign books, such as translations don't sell, or readers don't like books by people with unpronounceable names. Translations always read awkwardly. And so translated literature was consigned to a sort of ghetto. But things have changed radically. Mainstream houses are publishing translations, and writers such as Elena Ferrante and Karl Uwe Knausgaard are household names. Translators now have a seat at the table and are part of the conversation, as well as leading the way in challenging the gatekeepers and spearheading bibliodiversity. So what changed and how? Recent years have seen the emergence of a strong and vibrant translation community, with translators closely networked nationally and internationally, and the main professional associations and literature organisations all working closely together. The Free Word Centre, which opened in London in 2009 and hosted the first International Translation Day, a key professional development event in the translator's calendar, has become a physical hub where the translation world gathers for training sessions and public events. This sense of community has been crucial in empowering translators to take an active role in working with publishers and arts organisations to increase the number of works of literature in translation and to promote them. It has also fostered training initiatives to develop a pool of excellent translators, resulting in a huge improvement in the quality of translated literature, which in turn boosts publishers' interest and reader demand. Although there is a growing appetite among publishers and readers for literature in different variants of English, this creates a false sense of diversity because only a small proportion of books published in the UK are translations, a mere 4%, compared with 20 to 40% in other European countries. Why is this? A 2011 study into the barriers to translated works among publishers and booksellers in the English-speaking world was carried out by the Global Translation Initiative, a joint international venture. This survey acted as a springboard for breaking down the barriers. Another milestone was the research published in 2015 by Literature Across Frontiers, based at Aberystwyth University, identifying the gaps, i.e., what is being translated and what isn't. The study found that 10 languages accounted for 70% of all translations published in the UK between 2000 and 2015, and that 9 out of the 10 most translated languages were European.
That's very interesting about how translation has sort of thrown off its shackles a little bit.
That is interesting, and it's great to know as well. Translations are seen as something much more viable now, thanks to the work of avant-garde houses. But now, someone like Elena Ferrante, for example, whom Ross Schwartz mentions, is a very, very popular author here in the UK as well than in English. And I noticed as well that one of my favourite Italian authors, Natalia Ginzburg, her works have been retranslated and have been well reviewed in the national papers. And it's good to see all these networks have been created. I didn't actually know that. It's something I've learned actually from Ross Schwartz. I didn't realise there were so many translators networks. I think I have been on the outside of it. And funnily enough, I had huge problems getting my first sort of big translation published. I did the translation in 2005. It's a translation of Pierre Reverdy's novel in verse called The Thief of Talent. And I realised it's one of my favourite books when I was about 30 years old, when I discovered it in 1987. And I realised in 2005 it had never been translated into English. I couldn't work out why. And so I translated it and tried a number of publishers, but nobody was interested.
Oh, wow.
However, I did manage to publish excerpts from it, one in PN Review, one in Poetry Salzburg Review, and another one in Shearsman magazine. And because of that, in 2014, I received a letter out of the blue from Wakefield Press in the US, which specializes in French and German classics, asking me if I'd translated the whole book, and if so, if I'd be interested in submitting it to them. And that's what I did, and I was offered a contract, and I was paid quite nicely for it as well. And it came out in 2000.
So it was a bonus.
Yeah, and it was definitely a bonus. And it came out in 2016 and was well reviewed in places, including the TLS. So that was great, and I felt much more confident after that about translating. And on the strength of that, I was commissioned by the same publishing house to do a translation of the first complete translation of Max Jacob's The Dice Cup, which was also published in 1917 as Pierre Reverdy's The Thief of Talent was. So
that's quite exciting. Because when you say that, how few things were translated, and then you get to be the first person to translate something, that must feel quite interesting to do.
It's absolutely brilliant, and I think Ross Schwartz makes a point as well about translators are also they're like scouts. They're like scouts looking for talent, to bring to the English-speaking audience. In a way, I do feel like a scout. Translated the first book into English of Ivano Fermini's Italian poetry. I did the first translation into English of Gazim Haidari's Bitter Grass, and Gazim's selected poems, is coming out in English in February. So I think hopefully I've partially paved the way for that.
Right.
So I do feel like a scout, and it's lovely to bring authors to the attention of an English audience, but also perhaps, as in the case of someone like Ivano Fermini, who is actually very little known in Italy, perhaps to bring the attention also of Italian readers back to his work. So, for example, Ivano Fermini's book, The River Which Sleepers Told Me, came out in a bilingual edition, Italian and English. So hopefully Italian readers will come back to him as well.
How does the translating feed into your writing in your own language?
I think it's absolutely key, and sometimes I get almost too soaked in translations I'm doing. So I think my first couple of books, Anonymous Intruder and Shifting Registers, published by Shearsman, I was definitely under the spell of Pierre Reverdy. But then I think my work moved more towards narrative under the influence of Max Jacob. My most recent collection, Night Window, which came out early in 2024, was absolutely soaked in Max Jacob's book. I mean, too much so, because I was translating his work during the period of COVID, and I was a bit weird anyway because of COVID. And I was writing this book, and his spirit was absolutely everywhere. Incredible. He's there in the writing. He's there. I mean, when I did a sort of reading for Lancaster Lit Fest, and I read as well I read from my collection, but I also read from Max Jacob, and I read from both books, and you could almost not distinguish between Max Jacob's work and mine, which is quite strange. But I think there are lots of differences as well. So I picked certain ones, but I can just sort of feel his ghost or his spirit, in my own writing. But hopefully, I do distinguish myself enough from Max Jacob in the book. But I mean, it's an honour for me to be soaked in his work. It's not a problem, really.
I've heard that sometimes the translator comes to the fore above the written, and they have to. At certain moments, we have to realise as a reader that we are reading the work of the translator on top of the piece being translated.
Absolutely. It is the work of the translator. And Max Jacob actually was especially difficult to translate because of wordplay, because he is quite ambiguous in French. There's almost a sort of autistic quality about some of the writing. It's almost sometimes deliberately kind of in riddles. So I had to kind of convey that in English. But what words could I use? How could I convey Max Jacob, convey the letter of him, convey the spirit of him, but also have it read naturally into English, while at the same time, which I think is very important, is to keep a sense of the otherness as well of the original language. So it's got to be maybe, read like English, but not. I didn't want to make it too English either. I wanted to preserve something of the original French, even in the translation, to keep that sense of sort of otherness of something which has come from a different country. So I wanted to keep that as well. But I tend to work intuitively as a translator, so I'm not that informed by theory. I know what my basic goals are. Luckily, I have a very good editor as well at Wakefield Press, who is completely bilingual, Mark Lowenthal. So he would sometimes pick up on sometimes I would make ridiculous mistakes, which he would pick up on, or he would say, look, you really need to try and perhaps render a bit more of the wordplay there, or sometimes I've gone a bit too far away from the original, trying to be inventive, and you say, no, you need to go, make your translation a little bit more literal here. So I'm lucky to have a very, very good editor there as well to pick me up on things.
The essential. Mm-mm. I've always really wanted to know from a translator, how do you translate dialect?
Oh gosh, that is, I don't think I've really had to deal much with writing with translation dialect. Not really. What I have done is I've tried to, if something is a bit slangy in the original, then I make it a bit slangy in English as well. So I forgot what the original in French was, but I remember in one of Max Jacob's prose poems, I translated it as somebody having a wonky eye, which is a bit slangy, but not. If you make it too slangy in English, then it sounds too English, if you see what I mean. Because you could translate something, I don't know, living in the north of England, if I translated something from Breton in France, which is where Max Jacob, and I tried to sort of do a few northern words from Lancashire, I think it would just be awful. Celine's book, Journey to the End of the Night, was translated into Italian, and because Celine uses a lot of sort of Parisian slang, the way they translated into Italian was to use Venetian dialect, which partly because Venice was quite closely linked to the First World War, as Journey to the End of the Night is. But it just reads terribly in Italian, trying to translate Parisian slang into Venetian dialect. So you have to be a bit cautious there, I think.
Yes, I can imagine. And like a fantasy question, right? If you could choose any writer from any language to translate your work, who would you like? Just imagine they could speak English, as well as they could speak their own language. Who would you like to translate yours?
You mean living or dead?
Oh, anything, either.
Oh gosh. Okay, into Italian, I would love for the Italian author, Italian resistance writer Beppe Fenoglio to translate my work into Italian, because he loved English literature of all kinds, and he really sort of cut his teeth as an author by doing translations, most of them from English. So, and he's a writer. I wrote my PhD thesis on Beppe Fenoglio.
Wow.
So I would love for him to translate my work.
So that would be the number one?
That would be the absolute number one.
I can't pretend I've ever heard of him.
He's not well known in this country, but a couple of his books have been translated into English. A Private Affair, I've forgotten the translator, but it's very, very well translated, actually. It's brilliantly translated into English. But he's very respected in Italy. In Italy, he's on the level with Calvino, something like that. But he's not very well known in this country, perhaps because his subject matter is very specific to the experience of being a partisan and civil war. But he's very, very good. He's better than Hemingway, I think, at writing about war.
Now, we're going to talk about one of your other hats, put on your next hat, which is that of a prose poet.
Okay.
Now, first of all, what is a prose poem?
I was dreading you asking me that, Jonathan. A prose poem is a short piece of prose which uses some of the narrative devices of a piece of, let's say, flash fiction, but also uses poetic tools such as the sounds of words, internal rhyme. Quite often, if you get a prose poem, you can actually put line breaks into it if you want to. But often, if you have a short piece of prose, poetic prose, it reads differently because you don't actually have the line breaks in it. It gives you lots of freedom, but with that also comes challenges, because if you don't have the discipline of having necessarily to create a strict story, then how are you going to engage a reader? So, but I think with a prose poem, you have to actually focus on every single word, just as you do with a poem. But there may not be any clear resolution, as there is, say, with a piece of flash fiction. I tend to think perhaps prose poems are a little bit like sonnets, actually, in prose, because quite often they're meditations or soliloquies. But I find that a lot of my short prose occupies a kind of grey area between flash fiction and prose poetry, to be quite honest with you.
I must say, I took the opportunity to read some of your work before making the podcast. I really enjoyed them, by the way.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And Jugglers.
Okay.
Well, no, don't defend it, because I really liked it. And I think that's a good example of illustrating what a prose poem is, because it is a story. And yet at the same time, at first I thought it was a poem.
You know, of course, Jugglers actually has line breaks in it, but some of the lines are quite long, and it is quite prosy as a poem. But I think you highlight something else important, that there is a story behind it, but often there are lots of gaps that the reader has to fill in for themselves. So a lot is kind of left to the reader's imagination, which can be quite nice if you enjoy reading that sort of thing. A prose poem can leave you, somebody once said, I've forgotten who, can leave you barking at the shape of air.
So that's like your jugglers throwing the pins over the nothingness.
Yes, yeah, over the nothingness. There is something in that as well, definitely.
So if we're looking at poetry, novels, I always think like a novel, we could say it's like a rat, right? Because it must get everywhere,
Gosh,
right?
that's a good
and
like
see
a rat,
everything, right? And this is just
that's
facetious,
great. I love like a rat.
A poem
yeah.
is like an Afghan hound. It's nice to look at, but, you know, can be quite a good guard dog as well. But usually you just want to stroke it. So what animal is a prose poem?
A prose poem maybe is a little bit like a cat dreaming out of a window, perhaps. Or a cat sneaking around outside, looking in at windows, looking perhaps where it shouldn't be looking. A cat can be tame and inside a house and domesticated, but during the night it can become quite feral again.
See, that's a really good example of your prose poems, because they do go like that, don't they? Yours, where they sort of open up and you think, well, where's it taking me? When I realised I was going to be talking to you, I was not frightened, but I thought, prose poetry. And I did have an image of quite dense, difficult to understand stuff. Is that defendable?
I mean, I don't know of too many prose poems that are actually not the best ones, are not difficult to read. I think a bad prose poem, quite honestly, is a poem that is overly poetic, overly self-conscious. That for me is an awful prose poem. I think every word in a prose poem, just as in a poem or a story, has to actually count and do its work. I tend to keep my prose poems simple. And then if you're reading somebody like Gertrude Stein, for example, her work depends on sounds, and a modern version of Gertrude Stein is Sheila E. Murphy in the States. And they're only difficult if you try and kind of impose a strict meaning on them, because quite often they depend upon sounds and associations rather than storylines. But I think most of my prose poems do depend upon storylines, even if the story is never quite resolved, which perhaps is what partially makes them prose poems rather than flash fictions.
And are they an Anglophone thing, or do we have them in other literary traditions?
But I mean, the French are famously responsible really for creating the form.
Right.
And Baudelaire coming up with the phrase poème en prose, which is like, a poem in prose. So for the French, in a way, there's no sort of contradiction. A poem in prose, it's not quite the same as prose poem, which sounds a bit like a contradiction, really. More perhaps in English. But the French do not have a problem with the concept. The Americans took up the prose poem quite enthusiastically from the sort of 1920s onwards.
So what are they called?
Kenneth Patchen, for example, was a big practitioner of the prose poem. The New York poets, John Ashbery, Kenneth Koch, Frank O'Hara wrote prose poems in the 1950s, and there are lots of others as well. And various anthologies came out. But here in the UK, the people were writing prose poems. I guess Luke Kennard is somebody who brought the prose poem to the public's attention. here. But more recently, it has gained acceptance now. You've had the Penguin book of the prose poem, which came out, I think, in 2019, something like that.
Is that a good introduction?
I think it's missing too many important people, to be quite honest with you. So I'm not sure it is that great an introduction, but I guess you could start because it's very easily available.
Right. And who's your favourite prose poet?
That's another good question. I love the work of Kenneth Patchen. Max Jacob is the Dice Cup are prose poems. I mean, Max Jacob in a way was the kind of, together with Gertrude Stein, was the sort of the forerunners of the modern prose poem. Great economy of words and not particularly difficult to read either, not really. And playing around with storylines, never been quite stories. Kenneth Patchen, the American surrealist poet. The very little known Corey Harding, who was writing in the late 70s and early 80s. His work meant a lot to me, but he's hardly known at all. Jeremy Over, he's a carcanet poet. I love his prose poems as well as his poems. His poems tend to work a lot with collage. And
we'll add Ian Seed to that.
I will add Ian Seed, but I can't really talk about him.
Yeah, it's worth checking out. Really it is. Ian, I understand you worked as a teacher as well, amongst like a stretch in prison as well. Not as a prisoner, but as a teacher. So I'd be really interested in your take on another piece from the Royal Literary Fund archive, which is Sheena Wilkinson writing this really touching letter to her teachers.
Dear teachers at Craiga Primary School, 1973 to 1980, and Victoria College, 1980 to 87. Do you remember me? Sheena Wilkinson, frizzy hair, chatty, smart? Maybe not. I was a teacher myself for 19 years and recall only a fraction of the thousands who passed through my classroom. Being the heroes of our own lives, we all imagine ourselves unforgettable. You certainly were. Mr. Thompson, interrupting lessons for games of 20 questions. You quickened my thirst for general knowledge. Mr. Farris, smoking a pipe at your desk, so that your face appears in my memory only through a grey haze. I'm sorry for being offended when you suggested that my story about 4 sisters owed something to Little Women. You were right, of course. Mrs. Jordan, my history teacher, thank you for making the past so alive. I'm sorry my diagram of a plague house was so gory in its depiction of people writhing in agony as their pustules burst. At least you could see I was interested. I think of you every time I open a history book. And you'll be glad to know I do that often, for research and for pleasure. Mr. Spence and Mrs. Leithart, thank you for believing me when I said I was going to be a writer. Thank you for your gentle critiquing of my efforts and for your forbearance in not calling me out on every influence. My lingering pony book phase, my Maeve Binchy phase. I knew it was time for me to leave the teaching profession when I wrote on a 12-year-old story, "This is tiresomely derivative." Thank you for being kinder than that. Kindness is what I remember most from primary school. In a poor area, I was one of the few children with books in my house and aspiration in my heart. One June afternoon, someone, was it you, Mrs. Brayshaw, or maybe Mrs. Pakenham, took the time to tear out all the unused paper in the class's exercise books for me to take home. Piles and piles of wonderful fresh paper for me to write my own stories. They were tiresomely derivative too, Enid Blyton and Noel Stretfield in those days. Thank you for not saying so. Thank you for not making me feel like a charity case as I gathered up the discarded pages, but instead like an artist claiming the tools of her trade. As a writer, I've received many welcome grants, but my first writer's grant, that first acknowledgement that I deserved patronage, was that big pile of primary school exercise book paper. I put it to good use. Recently, I found a book of stories I wrote in 1979. It included a note to the reader. "Thank you for choosing this book," said 10-year-old me. "You have made a wise choice." Where did that confidence come from? Some of it was innate. Some of it was certainly encouraged by supportive parents and a house full of books. But some of that absolute certainty of my own worth came from you, my teachers. Thank you, always, from Sheena Wilkinson.
Ian, when you were a teacher, did you ever smoke a pipe at the desk?
No, I didn't. No, I did not. It's funny, but it does bring back the way teaching used to be back in the 1970s. I cannot remember any of my teachers smoking a pipe. I remember one smoking a cigarette, but not inside the classroom. But I remember my philosophy tutor at Nottingham University used to smoke a pipe during tutorials, which was very endearing. I think it was just something very reassuring about it.
And did they throw chalk at you?
I don't think I ever had a teacher throw chalk at me. I got slapped around the face. I got caned, as you did in those days. But I don't think I've had a teacher throw chalk at me, thank goodness.
I agree with you. I think that Sheena Wilkinson's letter there is really beautiful and quite touching. You're a teacher, I was a teacher, yeah. So it's really nice to hear. Did you enjoy being a teacher?
I've always really, really enjoyed being a teacher. And I've sometimes occasionally had emails from people I taught years and years and years and years ago. I was a teacher of English as a foreign language from 1981 to 1988 in Italy and in France. And I have had the odd email, just they've managed to find me online and then send me an email saying, they still remember me teaching, including teaching in high schools and universities as well as in businesses. So, and then I stopped teaching for a while. I was sort of working in an office for a number of years, but I came back to teaching in 2005 in creative writing, mainly in community settings, before going on to teach as well in academic settings.
Is that when you were in prison?
When I was in prison, yeah. This was for most of my teaching in creative writing was done for either Lancashire Adult Learning or for Lancaster Litfest. Lancaster Litfest ran some fabulous community projects, and one of them was doing a week's course in HMP Preston, and it was coming up to Valentine's week, so we did lots of reading and writing about love. And there was a brilliant designer for Lancaster Litfest, so at the end, the poems and the stories, the small stories, were put together as a pack of cards with pictures of the prisoners on the front. So we've got an anthology of the prisoners' writing produced on a pack of cards. Brilliant idea, not mine, unfortunately.
It's quite moving, that, isn't it?
It is moving, and I know they really, really enjoyed it because I had feedback on it as well.
So as you are taught, so you become the teacher. David Herbert, does that ring any bells for you?
David Herbert, it's fun. It's brilliant that you bring up his name, actually. Yes, David Herbert was was an English teacher in the sixth form, and he was when I was in the sixth form, he was a published poet himself. He had a couple of small collections published by Outpost, which was a leading literary magazine at the time in the mid-1970s. I told my A-level English teacher I'm writing poetry. He said, "Well, you should talk to." He wasn't that interested. He said, "You should talk to David Herbert because he's a poet and he is a contemporary poet. So you should show him some of your work." And although what I showed him was quite awful, he gave me some feedback and encouraged me to bring some more work back to him. So I brought in some more poems, and he gave me a bit of criticism. And then I brought in some more a couple of months later. So he was very, very good at giving. He was almost like a creative writing tutor then, even though there wasn't such a thing really as creative writing in the UK. But he was a bit like nobody was paying him for it. He was doing it just because he was a nice guy. And then he eventually gave me a list of magazines, and he actually duplicated my poems in the school duplicate and encouraged me to send stuff off to magazines. And eventually, after about 20 rejections, I got an acceptance by a small magazine called Gong. But I owe a huge amount to David Herbert, because if he hadn't encouraged me in that way, I probably wouldn't have been sending off work to...
How old were you when you were sending work off?
I was 17, 18, 19.
Enfant
so I was quite
terrible.
young. I always been enfant terrible. Unfortunately, I was never that good, to be honest with you, but I did write the odd really good thing, and then I had a bit of encouragement from editors as well. So
all thanks to David Herbert.
But a lot, and also my mum as well. I shouldn't forget her, because she always encouraged me. So, and she typed up my poems for me as well. So,
did she like your poetry?
She didn't always like all of it, but she gave me. She wrote poetry herself, and she was a very good at writing sort of quite minimalist poetry, and she'd always tell me you have to make every word count. She didn't like all of it, no, but she always encouraged me nevertheless.
Yeah, that's important, isn't it? Do you think, having taught creative writing, do you think you can teach writing?
I think you can teach a lot about the process of writing, and by giving feedback and encouraging other students to give feedback. Yes, you can teach it. You can't teach anybody to have the gift of being a writer, but you can teach a lot. I mean, I learned a lot from David Herbert. I learned a lot from my mum, and later from other poets as well, and other writers. And I did an MA in creative writing at Lancaster University. I definitely learned quite a lot there about storytelling techniques and the disciplines of writing. It sounds a bit sort of one-dimensional, but you can teach a lot about the process of it. And in doing that, then you are teaching it. And I've seen students, as a creative writing tutor, I've seen students really come on from the first year to their third year onto MA level and become really good writers, actually.
So that process of becoming a writer is a long, winding road, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that takes us nicely into our technical slot, where we look at a question to do with the practical aspects of writing. Now, you're quite interested in the importance and the skills and the dynamics of drafting.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
I understand you were saying about your belief that we have to accept imperfection and messiness as part of the process of writing.
Absolutely. I don't think we can really be right. I don't know if you agree, Jonathan, but I don't think we can be writers without accepting the messiness of writing, because even if you're a careful planner, you're still going to be changing lots and lots as you go along. And I mean, novelists will talk about the messiness of writing as well, and not just poets. But my own process, I tend to have quite a sort of mess of images and words, and maybe sentences which don't fit in anywhere at all. But then I will go back to them and start to draw out the threads of a narrative or a poem.
Do you enjoy it?
On the whole, I do enjoy it, otherwise I wouldn't do it. I do sometimes get tired. I got very tired this Christmas. But what sort of brought it back to life again is being asked by Modern Poetry and Translation to do some more translation work for them. And so that's got me back into writing again as well. So that's another example of translation feeding back into writing.
That's a lovely looking magazine. Modern Poetry and Translation, isn't it?
Yeah.
I do agree with you about we have to accept the messiness, but as all things in writing, it gets bigger because it's the messiness of life, isn't it?
Gosh, that is a good point. Yes, it is the messiness of life, and I guess when you're writing a story or a poem or an essay, you've got to somehow reflect the messiness, but at the same time create a kind of order, a kind of narrative.
Yes. Yeah.
So it is always a sort of compromise, isn't it?
And when you were the RLF tutor at university, when you were dealing with students, because you were saying how they find it difficult, this idea of redrafting stuff, and did you find that going through that process with them helped you when you came to your own sort of like redrafting and that kind of mechanical process?
It's true as well. It's made me actually more aware sometimes. I've been rushing something a little bit with my own writing, or thinking I've got to get this right, and getting a bit impatient with myself and wanting to sort of maybe just give something up. I sort of have to sort of remember what I tell the students, because I usually give them a very specific set of instructions about reading, researching, brainstorming, planning, writing a first draft, writing a second draft, at least 2 drafts, writing a penultimate version, writing a final version, checking the final version. So I say to Ian, do what you don't just, do what you tell the students to do.
Good advice.
Yeah.
So now we'll go to Anne Morgan, who has the latest RLF news.
Stories of remarkable women dominate the latest publications from Royal Literary Fund Fellows hitting the bookshop shelves. Franny Moyle's Mrs. Kaufman and Madame Lebrun, published by Apollo, presents the stories of 2 brilliant women artists whose lives straddled the political upheavals of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Meanwhile, Atlantic Furies by Midge Gillies, published by Scribe, uncovers the stories of aviators Elsie Mackay, Lady Anne Saville, Frances Grayson, Ruth Elder, Amelia Earhart, and Mabel Bowl, who risked everything to prove that women could fly the Atlantic. On Tuesday, 21st of October, Gillies will give a lunchtime lecture at the RAF Museum's Midlands site. Visit midgegillies.com for more information. A Royal Literary Fund Fellow has hosted The Adverb, the live edition of BBC Radio 4's poetry and new writing cabaret show The Verb. Writer, rapper, educator and world record-breaking beatboxer Testament was joined by guests Daljit Nagra, Kate Fox, Andrew Macmillan and Kirsty Taylor. Recorded at St George's Hall as part of the Bradford 2025 City of Culture celebrations and Bradford Literature Festival, the episode was broadcast on the 17th of September and is available on BBC Sounds. An RLF Fellow is among the cohort of writers commissioned to produce a work for a former BBC drama slot relaunched this year by Channel 5. Lydia Marchant's Never Too Late, co-written with Simon Warne and directed by Sarah Harrock, is one of 4 standalone works announced for Play for Today, a revival of the television anthology drama series that ran on BBC One from 1970 to 1984. With a cast featuring Anita Dobson, Nigel Havers and Tracy Ann Oberman, Marchant's drama is an irreverent take on ageing, following the rebellious Cynthia after she moves into a deceptively peaceful retirement village. Production has started on all the commissioned works, and the first play in the series is set to air before the end of the year. A panel of RLF writers will consider the importance of place in Morpeth this week. Starting at 4 p.m. on Tuesday the 30th of September at the Northern Poetry Library, Christy Ducker, Zoe Howe and Harry Mann will talk about the places that matter to them, using short readings from fellow RLF writers in the RLF Sound Archive as a springboard for discussion. The free staged conversation will last an hour, finishing with an audience Q&A. Register for a ticket on eventbrite.co.uk. 4 literature festivals will host events in connection with RLF's Writers' Mosaic platform, focusing on writers of the global majority in October. The schedule kicks off with John Sadiq discussing the journalists who transformed Britain with Yvonne Singh at Ilkley Literature Festival on the 4th of October. Malcolm X forms the subject of a discussion at Birmingham Literature Festival the following week. Then, on the 24th and 25th of October, the platform moves to Manchester and Sheffield, where nature and multiculturalism will take centre stage. For more information, visit the festival websites. And finally, 2 Royal Literary Fund Fellows have received residencies under a new award founded and supported by Booker Prize winner Bernardine Evaristo. Satinder Chauhan and Claudine Tuchenji are among 10 writers granted a stay in a cottage on the Kent coast under the new Royal Society of Literature Scriptorium Awards. Providing free writing residencies lasting up to a month, the scheme offers uninterrupted time for professionally active writers to focus on their projects. Each writer will also receive a bursary to support them taking up their residency. For more information, visit rsliterature.org. And now, back to the studio.
Thank you, Ian. I really enjoyed that trot through the world of a cat as a prose poem, and of the redrafting and of translating. Very interesting. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, and thank you for your questions. I really appreciate them.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFCollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.